Cool. All right. Well, today we're joined by Andrew Knight, the Global Data and Tech Lead at the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, otherwise known as RICS, a leading membership body who work across the built and natural environment. Andrew's been there for 14 years, I think. Andrew, would you like to just introduce yourself and say a little bit about yourself and your role within RICS?
Yeah, thanks, Olly, and thanks for having me on for this conversation. Yeah, as you said, I've been at RICS for 14 years. I'm not a chartered surveyor by profession. My background is more kind of commercial IT and technology. But after 14 years, unless you've kind of walked around the building with your eyes shut and your ears closed, it's very hard not to learn an awful lot about the built and natural environment. I've done a number of roles across the organisation, but currently I work within our kind of thought leadership and analytics part of the organisation, really looking at the effect of AI, data and tech right across that built and natural environment, how that affects our CPD requirements for our members, the sort of training, the kind of knowledge they need, and the impact on roles and the profession indeed looking forward. So really exciting role. Huge amount going on. RICS, as you mentioned, we're a member organisation, but we also set and regulate standards. And whilst the majority of our members, probably 60% are based in the UK, we then have our members working right across the world. So it's a global profession as well as obviously very focused on our members in the UK.
Great. Thanks, Andrew, for that introduction. When we were talking about what the discussion points today, we were actually coming back to there's so much going on in technology at the moment with AI and everything else. There's a lot to choose from. And actually, we talked about the importance of taking a step back from a business perspective and actually talking about ROI and actually what can technology do to drive business performance. So we're going to talk a bit more about today about delivering ROI and how technology can drive commercial success for companies in the built environment. So I think that's a really interesting area to talk about. I think before we get into that, just from your point of view and for clarity for people who aren't directly in this space, what exactly is the built environment in terms of the industries and the types of companies that work in that area?
Yeah, it's good that we cover this off because there can be a danger, and I think particularly with terms like prop tech, that people can get a slightly narrow view, particularly given what the RICS profession represents, of how broad the practice areas and firms and individuals are across the built and indeed the natural environment. And I always talk about the fact that if we look at what RICS members do, apart from being architects, they're involved in every part of that built environment. And really, if you start off and think about land use, rural land, planning and development, construction, the brokerage and agency of building, valuation of buildings, building surveying, building operation, building maintenance. And also, if you add the kind of other dimensions of the different kind of asset types, I've obviously mentioned land itself and thinking of land use, but you've got residential, you've got commercial, you've got the alternative commercial asset types now of things like senior living and self-storage and data centers. You've got infrastructure, railways, tunnels, bridges. So you've got a huge range of asset types that our members in the profession work with, and they have to do that right across that whole asset cycle, from a brown greenfield rural setting all the way through to demolition and end of use and circular economy. And you've also got to add in that other dimension, in the sense that you've got, like any profession, some very large household name firms working in all those sectors, but then through SMEs, micro businesses, people working for local central government and other project sponsors. So it's a very multi-dimensional space in terms of the size of firms and the practice areas that they work on and the assets that they work on.
Absolutely. So it's quite a diverse and complex space in terms of those different stakeholders and companies and businesses that work within it. And I think we'll come back to that a bit more in a moment. But I think before we go into that, actually just stepping back and looking at what we define as a business problem from an ROI point of view, what are business challenges? And from my point of view, I typically think about, finance, time, risk mitigation. So make more money, save money, save time, or mitigate risk. And does that align with your perspective, if we talk, just so we're on the same page about what business challenges are?
I think that those are clearly business issues that are quite generic, not only to the built and natural environment, but businesses generally. You want to be more efficient, you want to manage risk out of the business, you want to be more productive, you want to provide better services. I guess also where we look at the built and natural environment with perhaps an additional lens is really the kind of technical issue of the kind of assets we're dealing with. and the fact that actually data and technology can help us to do things we probably couldn't do before. So it's one thing to kind of streamline your finance operation and look at sort of the way you record information, the way you manage data, but there are some also very exciting areas where technology can simply allow us to and if we think of things like building information management and some of the kind of ways of capturing information using thermal images, for example, there are simply technology now that can do things that we simply couldn't do before, and they certainly then relate back to efficiency and productivity, but there are some kind of leading edge and in fact well established technologies now that simply allow people in the built environment to do things they couldn't do before, in addition to the very sensible and very important areas of productivity and risk and improving overall business efficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. I think thinking about the built environment and real estate, as you mentioned a minute ago, it's quite complex. It's well established, obviously, being the built environment. There's a lot of huge amount of existing infrastructure, so you can't, for example, turn buildings smart overnight and enable technology data gathering to happen in that way. There's a lot of legacy systems, paper, on device, on-prem, diversity of data in terms of where it's actually stored. Does that create additional challenges in terms of just the nature of the built environment and the way that it is and the history of it?
I think it does, because you effectively have, I guess, a couple of points I would make there. One of which is that quite often the built environment in terms of built assets are a lot of one-offs. I mean, there is a degree of homogeneity. You walk around the street and you see very similar houses, you'll see very similar office blocks, but in terms of where they are, the fit out, the construction, there's quite a lot of a difference between this and making a car or an aeroplane, where you've got that a controlled environment in terms of the construction phase, for example, and you've got the repeatability that you see in the platforms that the car industry might use. So you have the fact that quite often we don't see, and there is obviously a move towards things like modern methods of construction and modular and volumetric construction, but you don't see that kind of repeatability quite yet that you do in other sectors. I think the other dimension is that you have an awful lot of built assets. If we think about the fact that we already have the majority of the buildings on the planet that we're going to have to deal with to, for instance, decarbonize, and so much of that information about these existing assets, or rather sadly, as we build assets as well and we don't necessarily curate the data well, so much of the information we need to manage and be more efficient with our built assets and indeed our land, and I'm thinking globally here, either doesn't exist, or if it does exist, it's held effectively in paper form. It might be digitized as a PDF or even microfiche. So we lack the kind of discipline and history we have perhaps for manufacturing, once again, as a proxy, where and we talk about, certainly I talk about this kind of challenge of documents to data. So much of what we know about buildings is either missing or it's available in document form rather than in structured data, and that certainly limits our ability to analyze, run analytics, and have cleverer workflows and more efficient workflows when we're still effectively shuffling around lease agreements as a Word document or a PDF, or we're looking at a boundary map, which is effectively a scanned image of a paper map. So it's that challenge around the quality and availability and the nature of the data that we have to deal with, and indeed the fact that a lot of data just simply hasn't been collected yet.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, because I think you've got almost looking back at what we currently have and the challenges with that. And then looking forward and going, okay, what's our future state look like in terms of a different way of working? And from a technological point of view, do you think in the built environment there's almost two jobs to do? There's the look back and try and improve the data we can get looking back to make decisions based on historic data, as well as look forward? Is it two jobs? Are they equally important? Does the built environment have to try and do both?
I think they're equally important in the sense that in an ideal world, we'll have good data on both the assets we're building today and the assets that we've already got, because we do need to retrofit a lot of existing assets given the net zero agenda in various countries. If you think of the UK particularly and the focus on the Golden Thread and Building Safety Act, we need to make sure that we curate data moving forward for our assets, but also collect data for existing assets. And I suppose that highlights another not unique challenge, but a challenge for the built environment, is that we talked about the number of firms involved, but we also have this kind of historical issue of handing assets across from constructor to occupier to asset manager, and so you go those information boundaries where you lose information, where different disciplines ultimately have to work together over the whole life cycle. And I guess the Golden Thread and Building Safety Act bring that to the fore, where you need to be able to curate data and pass it from one stakeholder to the next and be able to report out to the government or whatever. So it's really important that we get this kind of whole life view of data and make sure that the different disciplines across the built environment work more closely together and transfer data to each other and share data.
Yeah, it's an interesting point there. You mentioned around sort of regulatory requirements around the Golden Thread, for example. And do you feel that companies working in the built environment, they're being driven by regulatory requirements to make changes, or they're driven by more commercial decision making proactively to going, we need to do this because it's the right thing to do, or is it both?
I think it's a mixture of both. I think with any kind of situation like this, it's going to be a mixture of drivers. There'll be a degree of regulatory pressure. Some of that is around obviously reporting for sustainability factors. And if you think of the EU as a jurisdiction, you've obviously got the Building Performance Directive, which will have a really big effect in terms of driving that agenda. Building Safety Act we've mentioned in the UK. So I think it's always going to be a mixture of that kind of regulatory impact. It's going to be project sponsors asking for information in a more elegant way in terms of the ultimate client who's building and maintaining their assets. And then you will have firms that realize there are opportunities to be more efficient. And depending on your viewpoint, it's become a bit of a cliche that the built environment has lagged behind in terms of productivity gains compared to other sectors. So there is a driver there that hopefully the C-suite realizes that done properly, data and tech and AI is an opportunity here to be more productive, be more efficient, and drive a more productive sector.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to drive that performance successfully, we often see that people are a critical part of that, maybe the most important part. And it's not just talking about the IT team, but actually the users of that technology within the business, and sometimes even end users if you're building a customer or partner portal, for example, where external people need to engage with you. And that adds complexity undoubtedly to the sort of adoption and rollout of new technology. And I suppose from do you have any thoughts on the best way to get buy-in from those user groups? Is it proof of concept? Is it surveys, like communication? What are ways to actually get the people and the stakeholders invested in this type of change through tech?
Well, I mean, as ever, it's not a tech issue. It's a change management issue. In the same way that you would be thinking about how you might do a major upgrade to your finance system, generically across an organization. You've got to take the people with you. You've got to do proper business analysis to understand really what the actual problem is before you even think about technology. And it is about educating people, making them understand why the change is happening. And as ever, always focusing on the process and those kind of issues before you get too wrapped up in the technology, and really understanding what the real gains will be. And as ever, classic sort of change management, what's in it for them? What's in it for all the people who will be affected by this? They're going to have to invest time. Obviously, from a CFO perspective, there's a resource and money issue, but from the people impacted on the desktop, they're going to be impacted in terms of the way that their work processes might change. And I guess one I think big opportunity when we take people with us on this is to think about the opportunity to think, well, we have a process. Let's not just digitize what we currently do. There may be better ways to do this. It's the old cliche that if you digitize a bad process, you just get a bad digital process. So there's obviously an opportunity here to also talk to the people who really understand what they're currently doing, what the outcome of the process should be for the client and the asset, and make sure you don't lose sight of really what you're trying to achieve here in the best way possible, and then see how that technology is the best fit to re-engineer, reprocess that, and have a more elegant, risk-free, more productive way of doing things.
Yeah, I think it seems to relate to it not just being a project for the tech team to manage and just look at the tech, but actually the finance team, the operations team, for example, those different stakeholders need to be invested in the project or whatever that piece of work is.
And if you're re-engineering the way cost consultants, QSs, quantity surveyors, take off quantities or manage procurement, talk to the people who actually understand the business process. And technology should almost be the last piece, because you're thinking, okay, how can we make improvements? How can we re-engineer the process? Where are the kind of value-add steps that don't really add any value? And what are the kind of real issues that people face? Where are the kind of productivity black holes where they're rekeying information, having to massage information, lacking information, and really start with that kind of data and that process picture before you start thinking about a particular technological solution.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you know, we've talked about this. There's so much technology out there, and AI is bringing that even more so to the fore. And that can be the challenge of decision, analysis paralysis. Just so much to choose from. And actually, there's also the challenge around, yes, AI is great at some things, but actually, AI can't write a lease, for example. It can analyze data from leases, but it can't create one. And you still need people with either to write them or to people to sense check AI's, has it actually done this job correctly? So there's a lot of choice, and B, sort of, you have to question always to make sure you validate the quality of what comes out. And I suppose my question would be how, particularly if you're not a super technical person, how do you actually go about evaluating the best technology that's going to suit your needs, and go about from that big sea of options? How do you go right, that bit of text, the one that's going to solve my problem?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot to unpack there, and ironically enough, you say AI can't write a lease. I'm not sure that will be true for much longer. I know of AI agents that are actually negotiating non-disclosure agreements with each other.
Okay.
So that probably won't be further away. But one point you did make is very important: is you still need that built environment professional in the loop to understand whether what's been written is correct and valid and effective. So you need that human check. I think once again it comes back to this fact that actually it's about the fitness of purpose of a tech solution to the real business problem, and this is why I would be to some extent critical of the prop tech sector, in the sense that a lot of very clever, bright technical people have come into that sector, but what it's left us with to some extent is an awful lot of solutions out there trying to do the same thing, and dare I say some solutions looking for a problem, and many solutions written by people who are very technical but don't have the built environment knowledge to understand the real business issues. And so I think that the challenge there is once again the question that from a procurement project management perspective is looking at the vendors, looking at the solutions out there. Does this actually solve the business problem? Do the people that have produced this really understand the issues? Do they understand the issues of data, for example? Will it actually solve the problem, solve the business problem? Because the way they do it technically may be an irrelevance in terms of whether it uses AI or not. It's probably fairly moot. Does it actually do what we need it to do, given the business problems, given the data issues? Does it have, in certain cases, the kind of audit trail explainability that you need? If we think back to that example of AI either sort of extracting something from a lease or producing a draft pro forma lease or other kind of document, can we understand how it's doing that sufficiently to trust it and still have that human in the loop at the end? So once again, it's kind of almost parking the technology and thinking more about the business need and what does this solution do? And have the people who've written it, do they understand the nature of the built environment? Do they understand the kind of data issues we might have? Is the technology going to try and rely on data that we don't have, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I suppose when part of making that decision about the technology that you choose, not only is it you need to think, well, is this really solving the business problem, not just a nice piece of tech? There's also, from an enterprise architecture point of view, thinking about how does that technology fit into what I've currently got, and I have already got something doing that job. So how important is it to do, you could say a whole scale tech stack review before you invest in a new piece of technology and think about how everything fits together? I
think it is, and I think another downside of the kind of innovation and proliferation of the kind of prop tech sector and the number of firms are out there. I mean, depending on who you read in terms of the estimates, there are tens of thousands of prop techs out there around the world. The challenge is you end up with lots of different applications that don't talk to each other, that don't have common APIs, and you don't have a common data repository, data lake, whatever term you want to use. So I think whilst on the one hand it's very good to pilot small scale projects, not try and boil the ocean, try and look at issues that you can pick off one by one, show an ROI, get buy-in from the organization that data and tech in whatever form can help with processes and help with making the business more efficient. At the same time, I think you need to be thinking, okay, we pilot, we test this, but will this integrate with our tech stack? Every time you bring something new in, is it the right thing to do in terms of solving that business problem? And thinking ahead, is this something we can integrate into our tech stack? I remember talking to somebody a few months ago who said, my heart sinks when we bring something else new in because it's yet another tab I have to open on my browser, was the phrase he used. And so it's that combination of doing an agile sprint type approach rather than trying to boil the ocean, but at the same time thinking, how will this integrate with our tech stack, whether that's a sensor for a smart building, or whether it's a document management system, or whether it's a piece of AI that extracts lease information. How does that fit within the rest of our architecture?
Yeah, and I think you mentioned when we spoke recently that there's no sort of SAP, if you like, for the built environment. So do we have to just accept that is the case, and there have to be some good APIs and some good governance and some, it's just that is it, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, if you look at even some of the very, very well established software vendors in the kind of built environment space, and I won't mention names, but I can think of a couple in the construction area where even they realize that they've built lots of different applications over the years that do a very good job on a particular part of the overall kind of construction life cycle, but they now realize that they have to be then part of a platform that they can then provide to their clients, so that actually they've done the same thing, which is built, ironically, a disparate tech stack of very good best of breed applications, but they're not integrated, and so they're almost having to go back a step and integrate their own products into a platform, so that their clients aren't buying separate bits of kit to do very good things, but that don't talk to each other.
Yeah, it's RICS is a global organization. I guess a question I was thinking about as you mentioned that was, is even more complexity when you've got multiple geos, multiple locations. Is that even more complexity to be considered? When
it is, and I think you that's why there's no sort of brownfield, greenfield to sort of demolition and recycling sort of ERP system out there for the built environment, because there are so many stages. It is a really, really big area to digitize from birth to death, if I can use that phrase. And also when you add in those kind of localization issues that the same things are called different things around the world, but you've got different things like different planning laws and construction standards and legislation and custom and practice and different building pathology. The way a building is constructed in South Asia will be very different from the way a building is created in Norway or Britain or in Pennsylvania. So you've got construction techniques that are different, building materials, different building pathology, construction methodologies that are different, zoning, planning, legislation, safety legislation, building control type legislation. All those are different. If you think of the valuation space, you've got different valuation standards working in different countries and different taxation and approval and property management laws. So you add that level of complexity, and so therefore applying a solution that you've written in the UK to work in Germany is not quite that simple.
No, it's another layer of complexity, isn't it? It's I think there's a lot going on, there's a lot to choose from, and I suppose sometimes it may feel difficult to know how to get started when you're thinking about, how do I decide what technology can help me to solve my business problems. And I was thinking about, it'd be great to get your perspective on whether businesses should, start strategically, for example, and think, okay, here's my business problem of I've got a revenue target of X percentage growth over the next 3 years, and actually how can technology help me to get there? And that's the sort of big strategic picture. Or is it more going, we've currently got an issue where our health and safety tracking on site is done through bits of paper that are then put into an Excel spreadsheet, and that's all sorts of problems we have of like data management and compliance and security and everything else, and there's a really specific problem there we can solve. So do you start big and think about the strategic value and then try and build the big business case, or is it easier to just go, there's a really specific thing here that's a challenge that we could do more efficiently and better? Have you any thoughts on that?
I'm probably going to cop out and say it's a combination of both, in the sense that what you need, I think, is the C-level to realise that, in the medium term, there is an opportunity to hopefully really increase productivity, manage risk, as we've talked, earlier, manage risk out of the business, improve the client service, and also maintain competitive advantage as well, because there is that level of defence on it. So I think at one level you need the C-suite to think, our organisation can be more digital. We can't do it overnight. We need to think about some to use the cliche, some tactical low-hanging fruit that can be proof of concepts, that can begin to demonstrate the ROI, and that we can analyze some quick wins in those areas and do this kind of sprint agile approach with all the kind of issues we've talked at. But I think what you do particularly need, I think, from the top level is a sense of an overall data strategy of actually what shape is our data in. I talked to a member of a large sort of cost consultancy last week, and we were talking about AI and those kind of topics. And as ever, there's a danger, particularly with all the kind of hype and the zeitgeist over the last couple of years over generative AI, that it's seen as a bit of a silver bullet, perhaps by the C-level to fix a firm's problems. And of course, unless your data is in a good state, it really isn't going to necessarily help in that broader sense. And once again, the emphasis there is on their data strategy, saying actually, what data do we have? What shape is it in? Is it in silos? How do we produce a data lake? So I think strategically, you do need to think across the organization and think that we need resource, we need teams to work on this, and we need to think particularly about a kind of an organizational wide data strategy. What state is our data in? How do we curate it better and get it into a much better shape to then leverage a digital approach? But then at the bottom end, you need teams going around identifying quick wins, both to get that kind of buy-in, to get the ROI, to show how you can get a machine that can absorb these new pieces of technology, but start with some of the quite prosaic things that you mentioned, perhaps document management in health and safety, use cases that can deliver some really quick wins, get the buy-in at every level of the organization, but not try and boil the ocean.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier that historically the built environment industry companies within there have been seen as somewhat lagging in terms of adopting technology, but are there any subsectors, if you like, within the built environment where you think that business or that type of business is actually doing quite well, and there's like where are some good examples, without, you don't necessarily have to name names, but just where we look at shining lights here?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of shining lights, and I think because the sector is so broad and is so fragmented in terms of size of firm, the disciplines, in every area of the built environment, right across the property life cycle, I can think of shining examples where people are doing really, really good stuff. The challenge for the sector is that that's not broadly trickling down. It's not consistent across the sector. So I can think of, and arguably it might be an extreme case, but if I think of some of the kind of uses of technology and AI in some kind of large pieces of infrastructure like nuclear power, there's some incredibly powerful things going on in terms of the kind of building information modeling, the use of AI to help people on site navigate really complex civil engineering. I can think of some very clever lease abstraction work that's being done using AI, some very clever work that's been done using AI to analyze planning documents when you have really complex planning applications. So there are lots of instances, smart buildings, lots of clever technology optimizing HVAC and producing sort of 40-50% savings on energy costs. So at every point I can think of some very clever technology, people using AI to both fly drones, using computer vision to triage defects on the facades of tall buildings. So there's lots of examples where people are using really good technology to do really, really powerful things. The challenge for the sector is that's not a consistent piece. And arguably, we have that challenge, like a lot of professions, in making sure that technology can trickle down to the smaller players, the SMEs, and just getting that consistency. And I think the big challenge, which we've kind of talked about earlier, is still this kind of preparation of the data, making sure that we get a better curated set of data for the whole built environment. If you try and buy or sell a house at the moment, most of the data is going to be pretty slow and hard to assemble, for example. Yeah,
absolutely. And thinking about RICS and your role, your team's role within AI and data and technology, where does RICS try to help your members and the built environment generally? There's a lot of stuff we've talked about earlier. Would you say it's in that area?
It's really, Olly, from a number of points of view. It's obviously educational. Our members do need to be brought up to speed with what's going on, knowledge and awareness of what's out there from a data and technology point of view. Once again, our members are predominantly SMEs. Most of our members don't work in the big household name property consultancies or construction firms, so it's helping particularly our sort of SME members understand how best to procure, to understand what's out there, to understand the kind of areas that it can help them run their businesses more profitably. We also do need to look at obviously the kind of CPD and the training offerings we provide. I'm currently technical author on a conduct standard on the responsible use of AI to make sure that our members use AI, but that they do it in a responsible way, that they still provide that reasoned advice, that they still understand the issues around liability, and indeed, as we talked about, checking the information that AI might produce on their behalf and making sure that they can be relied on and still have that professional skepticism, that reasoned advice, because they've looked at the data, they looked at the information, they understand what they're working with, that they can trust it. So, it's a number of things. We need to make sure our sort of regulatory and standards offering reflects the use of technology, but at the same time, make sure the profession does take advantage of it.
Absolutely. I think something we're talking about at our company is just the need to actually just test out AI and keep using it, really. And you won't always get it right, but you've got to give it a go and see what it can do for you and test and learn.
I mean, our view is to embrace it. As ever, it's not a silver bullet. There'll be certain tasks that it's very good at, certain tasks that it'll be less good at if you don't have the data, for example, or it's just not suited. And just embrace it. And like any technology, use it when it's appropriate, but don't use it when it's not the right solution. There is a danger that people get into the kind of tech for tech's sake. Tech is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. Shiny technology is all very lovely, but this is about running profitable, safe businesses and using technology in a responsible way when it delivers what you need and does it at an acceptable ROI.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that comes back to really where we started off, which was about trying to drive ROI in the business and always start with that business problem first. Think about then how the technology can help you to solve that, and you're starting from a good place.
Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time, Andrew. That's a really interesting chat. I enjoyed it very much. Hopefully catch up with you soon, and we'll leave it there for today.
Indeed.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.